I have been an advocate of soil blocks since I got my first soil blocker 3 years ago. I use it every year to start seeds, and while there are a lot of benefits to using soil blocks, there are some downsides as well. And I'm going to share those with you today, along with some possible solutions, a very honest review, if you will, and whether or not I'm going to continue using them in the future. So this year alone, I've started thousands of seeds in soil blocks. I have a whole bunch of them on this shelf just behind me. And while I do come down here once, sometimes twice a day to check on all these seedlings, the major downside to soil blocks is that if you forget, they can dry out really, really fast. And we'll talk about that more in a minute, but I want to start with how tedious they are to make. Now, I suppose this depends on your preference. You can fill a tray with seed starting mix or potting soil in 10 seconds, but it takes a little bit longer than that to make soil blocks, especially if you're filling a larger tray. And some of my larger green trays fit 160 soil blocks. There. So there's the 3/4 inch soil blocker, and it makes 20, and I have to make 8 sets of these to fill my big green trays behind me. I do use some smaller trays. This has 2 sets of blocks, which is 40. This one is Schizanthus, Angel's Wings, and this one, which is Dara, has 3 sets of blocks. So this one has 60. So the biggest draw for the soil blocks is, first of all, to cut down on plastic, and second of all, not to waste seed. When I make soil blocks, I put 1 seed per block only. Even if I have bad germination, within a couple of weeks, I can take the successful ones and pot them into cell trays. And that means no root disturbance. I don't have to separate anything if 2 or more come up in the same cell. And that is really quick and really convenient. And what I find is at the beginning of the season, I'm happy to come down here and get all set up and make a whole bunch of soil blocks. And I do that 2 or 3 times. But as it gets later and later in the season, the novelty wears off a bit and I get kind of tired of it. And I end up just filling seed trays, broadcasting the seed across the top, and then transplanting them later. So it's a toss-up. Do you want to spend time at the beginning making a whole bunch of soil blocks, to have to just pick them up and transplant them later on, which is really easy? Or do you go the easy route at the beginning and just broadcast on a seed tray and spend a little bit more time separating them and potting them up later on? Making soil blocks does cut down on plastic use in terms of cell trays and things like that, but I often end up potting them into cell trays later on, because I find potting them up into the 2-inch blocks takes up a lot more space. So where I start things in the 3/4 inch blocks to save space and save plastic, I don't end up using the 2-inch blocker to pot them up. Maybe I should. I need to get some better trays for that, which again would be buying more plastic. And I'm not sure that I want to do that. I have a whole bunch of 1020 trays right now that I didn't buy new. Most of these I rescued or were given secondhand. So that's keeping ones that had previously been bought out of the landfill. And that really is the first step to reducing plastic use, is taking care of the plastic you have and not throwing it away and putting it in a landfill. So they can be a bit tedious to make. If you don't mind the process, it's not too bad. The second issue is you have to be really careful watering them. Now, I've got a system at this point. I have a small watering can with a very fine rose on the end that I can water from the top, and I use that initially to make sure that the seeds sitting on top of the soil stay moist. And then once the seeds germinate, I prefer to pour a little water around the side of the tray and let the blocks soak them up from the bottom. Very carefully though, because if you pour too fast, you can move some soil around and destroy the blocks that you worked so hard to make in the first place. So now back to the blocks drying out quickly. It's a good idea to have a fan on your seedlings to help them grow strong and healthy. It also helps prevent mildew and algae, but that really does contribute to drying them out so fast. If you have a fan on your seedlings, even on low speed, you might have to come down and water your seedlings twice a day. So not a problem if you check on your seedlings often, but if you go away for a day or so, or you forget to come down one day, then that could be a big problem. It really doesn't take long for them to dry out to the point where you can't bring them back again. So one benefit that's often mentioned with soil blocks is that your plants will root prune themselves, where the roots will get to the edge of the block and they will just stop growing. And around the outside, that is true, but in the middle of the grid, there is not a lot of space in between these blocks, And it's really common for the roots to hit the bottom of the tray and then start growing sideways. And then they will tangle together. They will even move from block to block. So to avoid that, you really need to keep an eye on them and pot them up before the roots get to that point. And unless you're taking, a stick or a butter knife or something and separating your blocks a little bit, which is going to take a ton of time, and that would be kind of a pain in the butt, your seedlings will definitely grow into each other at some point, and then you won't get that benefit of not disturbing the roots because you're going to have to tear them apart or separate them somehow when you go to pot them up anyway. So I went through this last night with a tray of snapdragons. I let them get way too big. I had 2 trays to pot up. One was perfectly fine and the other one was not. So those roots got a little bit damaged, but they did have strong, healthy root systems, so they will recover. But they may sulk for a couple of days or so and not grow a whole lot in the meantime. So I mentioned what I end up doing later on in the season is just broadcasting on seed trays. I've got some deeper white trays up behind me that are smaller and some bigger green trays, the same trays that I used to start soil blocks in. I end up just filling and seeding. And that can work really well also, especially if you separate the seedlings early on before the roots get too tangled together. But that's not a whole lot different than what you would encounter if you let your soil blocks go too long anyway. So another thing to mention, and this can be a general comment for all seed starting, is that you do not have to use a seed starting soil that has no nutrition in it. It is true that your brand new tiny little seedlings don't need nutrition, but they will very shortly. And their ability to take up a little bit of nutrition from the soil is actually going to benefit them in the long run. It's also really easy to underfeed or overfeed or give your seedlings the wrong thing if you're a new beginner. So it's, in my opinion, it is so much easier to take that completely out of the equation and just start your seedlings in potting soil. Out in nature, seeds do not grow in a sterile mix. They don't grow in environments that have zero nutrition. So you don't have to worry about a seed starting mix burning your little seedlings. With quality potting soil, that should not be a problem. And as a new gardener, it's going to make your life so much easier. So I mentioned using a fan before, and that's the last main point that I want to talk about today is air circulation and algae, possible mildew issues. And that can be a real problem with soil blocking. You've likely heard people tell you to sprinkle cinnamon on top of your soil blocks or seed trays to keep the algae growth down, but that's really just a band-aid fix. It's not really likely to solve your problem, but there are a couple of things you can keep in mind to help. And air circulation is the big one. Algae grows a lot easier in damp, humid environments, and just the air circulation over the top of your seedlings can help keep that humidity a little bit lower. It's also really helpful if you sterilize your seed trays and your watering cans. And I say that from experience. Just the other day, actually, I noticed my little spray bottle that I've been using to mist the tops of my tiny seedlings and my soil blocks that hadn't sprouted yet. And on the bottom, it was a little bit green. There was algae growing inside that spray bottle. And we have well water, so there might be a tiny little bit of something in that water that's causing algae to grow. But it's worth keeping an eye on, How long has it been since you've actually looked inside your watering can to see how clean it is? A little bit of dish soap and a bottle brush will usually solve that problem for you. And then the same thing with your seed trays, just a little bit of soapy water. And then I like to leave them out in the sun after I wash them. And that's usually enough to take care of the rest. And then we come back to these trays. This tray that I showed you before has low sides. And that is not true with the green trays that are up on the shelf behind me. They have fairly high sides of, I think, about 2.5 inches. And that's going to hinder airflow. And I do notice a little bit more algae growth on those than I do on, say, these trays here. Not usually enough to be a problem, as I usually do pop my seedlings up before they get to that point. But another benefit of broadcasting them and then separating them out later is all that soil on the top is not going to follow the seedling to the new plug tray. So if you get a little bit of algae growth, it's not going to be a problem once you pop them up. And you also don't want to overwater your blocks. And you're thinking, well, hang on, didn't you just say that they dry out really fast? And yes, they do. But if you water them to the point where there's water sitting in those trays once the blocks have finished soaking them up, and they're staying really saturated for too long, well, there's 2 problems. You're going to cause algae growth on top, other mold and mildew, and maybe damping off disease. And you're also restricting oxygen to your roots. And seedlings need that air, that oxygen, just as much as they need moisture in their roots. So I like to water a little less than I think they need, and once they soak them up, if the blocks are moist to the middle, that's it. It may be able to soak up a little bit more, but I'd rather water twice a day and not keep them absolutely sopping wet than overwater them once and then cause some problems. So the last thing that I tend to notice more with soil blocks than I do with other methods of seed planting is how easy it seems to be for the seed leaves to stay stuck inside the seed casing. So if we have a look at these have just come up, but about half of the seedlings are still stuck in the seed casing. And that happens way more often with surface sown seeds, because when seeds are buried beneath the soil, as they come up, there's resistance that pulls on that seed casing, and when it's underground, it's also not drying out. So the resistance of the soil does a lot to pull the seed casing off of those first seed leaves. Whereas in soil blocks, there is no resistance, and it's also likely to dry out a lot faster and get stuck. So back to that little Mr. Spray bottle, I use that a lot when the seedlings are first germinating to keep the seed casing moist, to help it come off. And another thing that I often do is sprinkle vermiculite over the top of the soil blocks too, so that there is a little bit of resistance, and it helps keep the seeds and then the seed casing from drying out and gives you a little more wiggle room there. So at the moment, those are my thoughts on soil blocks. It is a great way to reduce plastic use in the garden. They're not perfect. I expect that the more I use them, the more little tricks I'll discover. And if there's something that I haven't mentioned that you find really helpful, please add that in the comment section below. Let's use the comment section as a helpful guide. If you have anything else to add respectfully to this conversation, I would love to hear it. I do expect I will keep using soil blocks in the future. After 3 years, I've definitely learned which seeds do well in soil blocks and which don't so much. So I'm going to make a more comprehensive list and then likely share that in the future with you too. So thanks for watching, everybody. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.